Welcome to the 2025 Anita and Antonio Gotto Lecture. We are so glad you are here. And now, please join me in welcoming the senior pastor of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, the Reverend Dr. Scott Black Johnston.
Good evening and welcome. Tonight's conversation is made possible by a generous gift from two of New York's finest educators. In their heart of hearts, Anita and Tony Gotto are teachers. Anita, an elementary educator with an expertise in child development, and Tony, a renowned cardiologist and former dean of Weill Cornell Medical School, saw the promise of this lectureship. It's because of the Gotto's vision and their hard work that we're all here tonight. Anita and Tony, would you please stand and allow us to thank you? At this time, I also want to thank the officers and volunteers of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, the church's maintenance, communications, security teams, and especially Natalie Wardius, Stephanie Kelly, Austin Appelbach, Jamie Staley, and Emily Dumbroff. Thank you, team Fifth Avenue. You have been, as always, downright fabulous. Thank you. And finally, I want to express my gratitude to a new member of this congregation, Catherine Ellis, who connected me to tonight's speaker and who, according to our lecturer, played an absolutely crucial role in making the book Circle of Hope happen. Catherine, where are you? Please stand. Thank you. Every once in a while, I play the game, if these walls could talk. If the walls of this sanctuary, completed in 1875, were to whisper in our ears, what would they say? They might speak about presidents who have worshiped here, Teddy Roosevelt, or noteworthy preachers who have graced this pulpit in the last few years, Barbara Brown Taylor, William Barber. If these walls could bend our ears, surely they would speak about the arts. They would tell you that in December of 1965, Duke Ellington and his orchestra performed one of his sacred concerts in this space. And on that night, Lena Horne premiered the song "The Christmas Surprise," filling this vast room with her tremendous voice. These walls might describe a rollicking 2009 funeral for dance legend Frankie Manning. Almost 2,000 people paid their respects to the founder of the Lindy Hop by doing the swing and the shim sham in these aisles, and yes, in that pulpit. These walls would surely testify to the time when acclaimed poet Christian Wyman read verse here, making us wince and laugh. And I think they'd talk about the afternoon when Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Marilynne Robinson spoke softly to us in this place, her steady voice challenging us and our faith to be bold. These walls would tell you that in this space, thoughtful people have consistently encouraged us to attend to the world, to attend to what is beautiful and what is ugly, to gaze unflinchingly at hard truths, and to seek hope in familiar places and unfamiliar places. I think it makes sense that this church spends so much time attending because, as poet Mary Oliver once observed, attention is the beginning of devotion. Tonight, we're blessed to hear from another incredibly attentive and devoted person, poet and journalist, Eliza Griswold. Ms. Griswold's work has appeared in The Atlantic, the New York Times Magazine, Harper's. A contributing writer to The New Yorker, Eliza's journalism recently included an interview with the Right Reverend Marion Budde, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, D.C., a woman who came to this nation's attention a little over a month ago when she appealed in a sermon to the newly inaugurated Donald Trump, asking him to show mercy. Eliza Griswold is also a poet. I've been reading her poetry this past week, and it's amazing. Her work reflects a life spent in some very conflicted parts of this world. Eliza's translation of Afghan women's folk poems, I Am the Beggar of the World, was awarded the 2015 PEN Award for Poetry in Translation. Evidently, you speak Pashto? No, I don't believe it. As a journalist, Eliza's been recognized as one of this country's most gifted writers in nonfiction. Her book, The 10th Parallel, examines the complex fault line between Christianity and Islam in Asia and Africa. It won the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize from Columbia University in 2011. Eliza's book, Amity and Prosperity, One Family and the Fracturing of America, has received more awards than I can list. One of them happens to be the Pulitzer Prize for Nonfiction in 2019. In the midst of these important projects, Eliza has also found time and a passion for teaching fledgling reporters in her current post as the director of Princeton University's program in journalism. Tonight, this accomplished journalist and thinker is here to talk about her new book, Circle of Hope, an embedded study of a progressive evangelical church with sites in and around Philadelphia. If you've read Circle of Hope, you know that it begins as an up-close encounter with a committed group of Christians who do not fit into America's cookie-cutter descriptions for evangelicals. The book then evolves into an honest, sad, and revealing study of a community roiled by many of the factors that have tied our wider society in knots: race, class, gender, human sexuality. And still, in the midst of it all, the people described in this book strive to be church, to manifest something of Christ's grace, love, justice, and mercy to the world. In her review of Circle of Hope, Jennifer Holberg says that reading the book reminded her of watching Hulu's television show, The Bear. In The Bear, talented, sincere, but also broken people try to do something good and noble together, and they do not always succeed. Featuring a lot of emotional intensity, strong language, and a fair bit of yelling, Holberg writes, Circle of Hope is profoundly painful, but utterly compelling. I agree. It is my distinct honor to ask you to join me in welcoming the brilliant, the compassionate, the insightful, the compelling Eliza Griswold. Knock him dead.
Thank you. Good evening. I'm so excited to be here. It really is such a treat, and I cannot thank you enough, Scott, for having me, and so much thanks to the Gottos for having me as well. It's a great honor, and I cannot begin to describe how much when I know her as Catherine Ellis, sitting in maybe the 12th pew back there, how critical she has been to the making of this book, to the editing, to the listening, to the research, to the rigor of some of the theology, to correcting my misunderstandings of exactly who did what in the Old Testament. So she's just been invaluable. And I did want to call out, say thank you to one other person, because with that recent interview of Bishop Buddy, so I got a call from my editors at the New Yorker who said, we want you to, can you interview Bishop Buddy? And I was like, sure. So I went to my secret source, my old babysitter, and was like, hey, do you have Bishop Buddy's number? And she's like, sure, here's Bishop Buddy's cell. And I got permission to do the interview and called my editors back, and I was like, okay, so I'm talking to Bishop Buddy tomorrow. And they're like, how did you get that so quickly? So a huge thank you to Jerry Wolf, Mother Wolf, as I know her, who is here with us tonight. So anyway, okay, so what I thought I would do, I very recently came across this remarkable book by Albert Hirschman, who is really an economist and a Holocaust survivor who helped smuggle people like the artist Chagall out of Nazi Germany and to safety. And he, as an economist, wrote this remarkable book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, which essentially answers the question. It's a response to decline in firms, organizations, and states. And essentially the question that he's asking is, when the organization, the political party, the church that you're in is in a state of decline, how do you respond? What do you do? And so I just wanted to read a paragraph from the introduction of his book. A lot of it is like economic theory that I cannot even understand. But the very beginning is so incredibly compelling. And I think that people talk about when you write a book, you don't really know, you learn what your book's about by writing it, right? And so in retrospect, taking some of the themes, especially as we watch the world move forward, has led to a deeper level of thinking for me and reflection, and this book really helps frame it. So Hirschman asks, under any economic, social, or political system, individuals, business firms, and organizations in general are subject to lapses from efficient, rational, law-abiding, virtuous, or otherwise functional behavior. No matter how well a society's basic institutions are devised, failures of some actors to live up to the behavior which is expected of them are bound to occur, if only for all kinds of accidental reasons. Each society learns to live with a certain amount of dysfunctional or misbehavior. But lest the misbehavior feed on itself and lead to general decay, society must be able to marshal from within itself forces which will make as many of the faltering actors as possible revert to the behavior required for its proper functioning. So this book takes this as a point of departure. What do you do when your society, when your church, when your organization, when your family is no longer functioning? How do you respond to that? Do you exit? Do you voice your dissent? Or do you remain steadfast and say nothing as a form of loyalty? So I know that this book, Circle of Hope, really, so many of my friends who have nothing to do with church, who are not interested, who are like, oh, you wrote a book about a church. And then they would read it and they would come back to me and say, well, this is really about my organization. This is really about the Audubon Society. This is about so many organizations that faced with the double pressures of the murder of George Floyd and pandemic really turned inward to face a kind of reckoning that in some cases was successful and in some cases wasn't, and in many ways has helped to lead us to where we are today. And Circle of Hope is one of those places. And as Scott said, I started out writing about this group because I was really excited about this kind of muscular devotion to being Christian and to living out. They live according, like as good Anabaptists, they live according to the principal tenets of the Sermon on the Mount. That is their absolute, from childhood, when I would hear certain kinds of Christians call themselves Bible believing, I didn't really understand that because all Bible is up to interpretation, and Circle of Hope takes this sermon quite literally and quite beautifully. And that has led them to do crazy things like dumpster diving dinner parties. For a long time, they didn't shower because they believed they practiced something called anarcho-primitivism, which posited that to throw off the sins of the American empire, you don't practice Western hygiene, right? So one of my favorite people in the book and my favorite members of the church, a woman named Bethany Stewart, would say that you could smell church before you reach church on Sunday mornings when these guys were in town. And all of these fanciful practices of really living the devotion to one's neighbor drew me to this church and to this place, especially at a time when in our larger society, Protestant churches were so in decline, and the question of the relevance of church was so before us. And dominant Christianity in much of the public sphere looked like a kind of evangelicalism that didn't look very much like the church in which I was raised as a child. So spending years embedded inside this church was an effort really, it began as an effort to show people what it really meant to follow Jesus in the most faithful possible ways, to give your life to that practice in 2018, 2019. And then between pandemic and George Floyd, very different strains, the church started to come apart. As so many of our societies, the pressures of being disembodied in a group that prided itself on being embodied, on being together, on being one or two gathered together as the body of Christ. And Zoom was not friendly to that process at all. And it did what it did to so many organizations. And my own little church in Philadelphia, people acquired a kind of, we called it internet brave was the term for it, but it wasn't brave. It was just mean. That there was a kind of ability to say whatever you thought with impunity. Now, that's not everyone's experience, because the truth is Zoom in diverse communities also allowed many people who wouldn't have had the courage in a room or taken the mantle in a room to actually speak up. And what Zoom laid bare in this church that I watched firsthand was iniquities of power that the church hadn't yet really reckoned with. And principally that was between the two male pastors and the two female pastors, but there were many other strains going on. So the book, as many of you have read it and some of you haven't, is about I follow 4 pastors over about 4 years, and instead the book is a tacit nod to the New Testament. So instead of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's Johnny, Rachel, Julie, and Ben, who each get to tell the story from their own point of view. And the book begins with just the epigraph of the book is just the very beginning of Sermon on the Mount, which I'll read to you, and then the rest stands as much as living scripture as any other human experience, as people doing their very, very best to follow God as faithfully as possible. So I'm going to read 2 short sections for you guys now, and then we're going to open it up and have a conversation and ask. You can ask anything you want. I'm happy to answer any kind of making of questions, but what I wanted to do is just steep us in the sounds of the book and the experience of the book at first. So, okay. Ben White was a committed pacifist, but on this July morning in 2021 in South Philadelphia, he thrummed with rage. His beloved and visionary parents were about to be cast out of the community they'd spent their lives building, and he didn't understand why. So you're saying it's either you or them, Ben said, glowering at his fellow pastors, who until recently he'd considered to be among his closest friends. Rachel Sensenig, the eldest and a kind of big sister, leaned forward to listen. Before her, on an open laptop, Julie Hoke was joining the emergency Zoom meeting from her parents' cabin in the Pennsylvania woods. Julie's round face, unadorned, kept glitching, as if her terrible rural internet service mirrored a spiritual disconnect among the four. The final pastor, Johnny Rashid, glanced up from his phone as Ben demanded to know what his parents, Rod and Gwen White, had done wrong. There was no hint of scandal, no rumor of sexual or financial abuse. The Whites cared little about money and were independently well off. Yet Circle of Hope seemed to be turning against them, acting as if my parents are a problem that need to be solved, Ben muttered. Every single ethical norm and practice of Christianity says that what your father Rod did was wrong, Johnny argued. It's sowing seeds of discord, he explained, a sin according to the Bible's book of Proverbs. That's just sanctimonious bullshit, man, Ben replied. Rachel slumped at the table's far side. She was tired of their arguing. This feels like a real masculine power struggle, she offered, a bid for top dog power. I really do think you guys need to go have a couple of beers. Ben and Johnny didn't seem to hear her. Hanging above them unanswered was the question of whether the church could survive. We need to have a reckoning to find out who's in the church and who's not, Ben told the other pastors. I won't kill this church because it's my whole life, but I could. All I have to do is quit. This is a little bit more personal. As I was reaching the end of my reporting and Circle of Hope was coming apart, my father developed a mysterious health problem. His lungs were drawing in plenty of oxygen, but holding on to carbon dioxide rather than releasing it. The carbon dioxide was poisoning him, causing narcosis marked by vivid hallucinations. In the hospital, he slept and woke and drifted off again, returning with otherworldly tales of where he'd been. He was coming and going from his place in line in a long wait for heaven. Their processing times were far too slow, he groused. How could they not have a better system? Slipping away, he returned again from elsewhere, this time a battlefield where good was wrestling with evil, an epic spectacle. Wait until you hear what I've seen, he told me, my sister, my mom, and Jerry. His blue eyes fluttered open. They were growing milky. He carried urgent messages impossible to understand from beneath the plastic mask he wasn't supposed to remove. He kept trying. He was pointing out the forces of evil crawling up the wall when a young pulmonologist stepped into the room, asking if my dad was on opioids. No, I told him, he's just a man of God. What were any of us to make of the unknown realms in which my dad seemed to be traveling? At one of his lucid moments, he asked me to fetch a small gray flannel satchel with 2 metal buttons from his bedside table. Inside was a Bible, bound together in red leather with a book of common prayer. Dad was a liturgy guy, meaning he cared a great deal about the prayers and practices of the Episcopal Church. His concern with arcane-seeming things, like where a crucifer stood, reflected his attention to the formal order of the ancient rites. He asked me to read the scripture for that coming Sunday, the third in Lent. Called in the ancient church, the Pericope Adulterae, this is the story of elders who tested Jesus by bringing to him the adulterous woman. According to the law set down in Deuteronomy, she is sentenced to death by stoning. Will Jesus follow the law, or will he break it by letting her go? Instead of choosing, Jesus bends down and writes in the dirt with his finger, uttering to the elders the famous injunction against human judgment, that whoever among them is without sin should cast the first stone. Then Jesus bends again and writes whatever he writes on the ground, which we never learn, and the elders, foiled, grumble away, leaving the woman with Jesus. Go and sin no more, he tells her. Reading aloud to my father, I recalled a member of Circle of Hope, Jen Shannon, recounting this story to me as the foundation of the third way. We were driving around Camden, New Jersey, delivering boxes of food for mutual aid. Casting aside the old laws, Jesus breaks the limited dialectic of salvation and damnation and comes up with a creative solution: mercy. This was the point of the story my dad wanted to tell me that afternoon. God doesn't choose to forgive or to love. God is mercy and love. How many times have I seen the words "God is love" stitched on a felt banner or printed on a well-intended ecumenical greeting card and found them empty? I've mistaken the limits of my understanding for the limits of the statement's meaning. It isn't that the woman didn't sin, my father mumbled from his hospital bed. Jesus tells her, "Go and sin no more." But whether or not she does change is immaterial to God's love for her. If she causes more suffering, then she causes more suffering, but this has nothing to do with the all-pervasive love that surrounds her, the testy elders, and Jesus on that hillside outside Jerusalem. And what of the elders who are forced by Jesus' question to interrogate their lives and search their souls until they surrender their judgmentalism and acknowledge that they too are flawed humans, that none is without sin? They aren't simply defeated by some Jesus-y mind game. They are transformed by understanding that they are implicated by the law they seek to enforce against others. Once we acknowledge our mutual vulnerability, we are less willing to wield the weapon of condemnation. This is the truth of empathy, a word too often bandied about in self-help and pop psych as simply meaning feeling for others. Empathy is transformative because through it we acknowledge a shared brokenness. But what of the dirt? What did Jesus write in it? Maybe he doodled in the dirt to allow a moment for the elders to realize they'd screwed up. Maybe, biding his time, he scrawled, "What jokers," or "Jesus was here." Or maybe he was recording the names of the condemned in the dust, fulfilling the Old Testament prophecy of Jeremiah. I couldn't ask my dad what he thought, since he'd slipped away again and didn't return to consciousness except to murmur, "Home," ordering us to spirit him out of the ICU and back to his familiar bed so that he could wait comfortably for his number to come up in heaven. 5 days later, he died in the ICU. Not in an apotheosis of mystical and beatific peace, but in terror, pain, and rage at those intent on delaying his journey away from us. To love is to grieve. Churches are messy places where people seek many things, among them a common understanding of something larger than they are, of God. This can be a beautiful, courageous endeavor that in its effort to do right usually goes wrong. Maybe churches need to die, to rid themselves of their old bodies, their advanced pathologies, to make themselves new again, to be free of the weight of a past none can carry. This cycle is, after all, the foundational principle of the faith. The theologian G.K. Chesterton says, "Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave." Yet the notion of a circle doesn't fully satisfy. Death and rebirth, the cyclical nature goes nowhere, doomed to repeat itself. This may be an honest assessment of the universe's affairs. However, it isn't very hopeful. In Rachel drawing a spiral, in Julie picking up a knobbed whelk shell on the beach, in Johnny's realization that leading the church and leading and healing himself were two separate endeavors, in Ben's acceptance of erasure and return to being humbled by grieving strangers, in all of these, there are hints of moving forward by breaking a cycle, not repeating it. The four pastors humbled one another, or perhaps harrowed is the better word, raking one another's souls like fields and freeing them to grow. It's uncomfortable to accept our flaws, let alone having them pointed out to us, hearing how we hurt one another and ourselves by clinging to received ideas. In some ways, this is the work of the exegete, to examine a story or an experience for what it reveals, not only about the world or God, but also about ourselves and what in our embodied consciousness must grow or die. Dying is difficult even when welcome. There's no controlling what our bodies say and do in their final, hideous, and terrifying paroxysms. It's a curious thing to be an observer of human beings in the midst of their great struggles, and it's easy to forget that as observers, We exist as humans alongside. My father died during Lent in 2023. Yesterday was 2 years, I just realized, Ash Wednesday. As I was leaving the church at the end of my father's funeral, I glanced into the forest of mourners and was startled to catch the sight of the pastor Julie in a black blouse and pants, a more formal get-up than anything I'd ever seen her wear. She cracked when I saw her, so did I. I hadn't imagined her visiting my world, and yet there she was, mourning the loss of a man she'd never met, as this, among so many other unseen acts of service, is what a pastor does. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliza. I really appreciate you reading both from the very beginning and from the very end of the book. In fact, I just reread the last chapter again today and found it profoundly moving. And I did note that it had been 2 years since your father's passing, and so something appropriate being here with the Lent purple. And I've got a Lent question for you here in a minute. But I'd like to start by putting a couple of terms out there, terms that, one that I think we know what it means, and I'm not sure we do, and then one that may be new to many people. And the terms are evangelical and Anabaptist. And the evangelical question's got a bit of a preamble. I'll whip through it quick here. I think evangelical has become one of the slipperiest words to define in American culture. As a high school kid, I knew what it meant to be evangelical. They were the kids who brought their Bibles to school in those zip-up pouches. I don't know if you ever encountered those.
No.
They had Jesus stickers on their notebooks and firm opinions on other classmates' eternal destiny, heaven versus hell. And they went to church all the time. They were in church on Sundays and Wednesday nights and Saturday afternoons. Nowadays, I don't know what an evangelical is anymore, because the Pew Foundation tells me that the fastest growing religious subgroup in America is evangelicals who do not go to church. Certain swaths of evangelicalism now look a lot less like local church-based faith and more like a political movement focused on wielding cultural power. I think your book adds another layer to the complexity of our understanding of American evangelicals, because you introduce us to a different sort of evangelical, as you point out, a sort of counter-narrative that's been around for a long time. And I'm wondering if you would spend a few minutes telling us about that counter-narrative. What strand do these evangelicals fall into?
Well, that's a very helpful preamble. And just to comment first, I do think we're seeing a moment where, much as the word 10 years ago, the word Christian became an identity marker away from the idea of religiosity. I think evangelical is Christian now. It means a certain set of political beliefs in many cases. And yet there are people struggling to reclaim the purity of the concept inherent in evangelicalism, which is the devotion of one's life to Jesus. And so to bring that forward a little bit, who are these progressive evangelicals who often people call them the evangelical left, which is not a term that Circle of Hope doesn't like. They really didn't want to be called evangelical. They were uncomfortable with the idea themselves for all the reasons we're talking about. But essentially what happened is during the same period of time, so when you think of what evangelicalism was over the centuries, right? There was always a sense that devotion of my life in a personal way to Jesus had political implications, not in terms of electoral politics, but in terms of service to the world, in terms of living out social justice in its most essential ways. You think of, emancipation being the most, abolishing slavery being sort of the principal engine was evangelical effort. So that's really, I want to return us to the roots of that understanding, because that's where many of the evangelicals who I follow really see themselves as spiritual children of that evangelicalism. And then we see, really beginning in the 60s and through the 70s and the 80s, as we see that there's the Jesus movement, right? The whites, Rod and Gwen White, are like Southern California hippie Jesus freaks. That's what they come out of. And, during the late 60s, in Haight-Ashbury, in San Francisco, as people were like dropping acid, there were street preachers entering the public square. And lots of those kids who were having bad acid trips or it wasn't working for them, the street preachers were drawing the counterculture to a different kind of moral call. And so then you have a movement where Jesus is cool. Jesus is the cover of Time magazine. Jesus is relevant. You've got, I grew up listening to the albums of like Jesus Christ Superstar, right? Like that was my childhood vibe. Even though that, and the Episcopalians in like bell bottoms, like doing liturgical dance. It was like a hybrid. But that said, so that's 60s, 70s, now into the 80s, as we see, Republican operatives, political operatives, explicitly team up with evangelical pastors to create a Christian right, to create a political movement, to really coalesce a movement, a voting bloc. You see the Christian, especially the evangelical left, begin to go underground. Now it continues, it really morphs. This kind of takes us to our next question of Anabaptism, right? Because it morphs away from what we think of as evangelicalism. It's allergic to megachurches, and instead it says, okay, let's work in non-hierarchical grassroots communities, but let's also have this call to social service. And you have Philadelphia as a real site of this kind of religious left. There are many Christian institutions there that belong to it. Messiah would be probably the principal one, Messiah College, now Messiah University.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
How many of you have heard of the name Tony Campolo? So maybe a quarter. So do you feel comfortable saying anything about Tony Campolo's influence on Philadelphia?
You say it.
Well, because Philadelphia really has become a very fascinating place in terms of sort of what I would call sort of experimental, engaged Christian communities. And there are a number of Princeton Seminary grads here, or people who are soon to be headed to Princeton Seminary here, but a lot of them are ending up going down to Philly to check out these funky churches.
Circle of Hope.
And Circle of Hope was one. Broad Street Ministries, Bill Golder, that's a Presbyterian version of what we're talking about. So there's a lot of these, and a lot of them trace their sort of DNA back to this guy, Tony Campolo, who was a famous teacher. He was at Eastern.
Yep.
And a lot of he was the kind of charismatic professor who would say, I don't give shit about something, and then he would pause and look at everybody and say, you know what the big problem is with religion in America? Is that most of you are worried about the fact that I just said that word and not about all the children that are starving in the world. That's the kind of Tony Campolo move that he would frequently do to try to say, let's have a real Christianity, something where the rubber really hits the road and we're making a difference in the communities where we're embedded. And so Tony, sorry, stop my interruption here, but Tony was sort of the godfather, if you will, of this movement that ended up with all sorts of these very interesting parishes being planted in Philly, and Circle of Hope is one of them.
Yeah, and one of the so where that goes from the case study of Philadelphia to like a national trend that was really exciting for me to think I was witnessing was what a lot of the young people, probably the people here who are going to PTS and all of that, but they come out of conservative, evangelical, rural Pennsylvania, right? Other places as well, but conservative rural America. And for a while, as we were seeing the death of all kinds of evangelicalism, conservative evangelicalism looked kind of imperiled because kids would leave their conservative childhood churches, they would come to universities in Philadelphia and other cities, and when in the city, they would be confronted with the gaps between what they had been raised with and what they were witnessing as Christian witness. And probably the most famous example of this, who's really a leader of this movement and who was a member of Circle of Hope, is Shane Claiborne, who wrote a book called The Irresistible Revolution. And so, Shane's mom still sews his clothes, and he's got 2 pairs of pants, and lives like under the, I'm not sure you'd call it under the poverty line, but deliberately keeps his income low enough so that he doesn't have to pay taxes to fund the US military. That kind of living in Christian communes. And for a while, during the Jesus Freak movement at its height, most communes in America were Jesus communes, right? So there was a hope, and I do think it is the past tense, but I don't think we're done with it, but that this strain outside of the dominant culture of Christian materialism that we were watching with, Jesus t-shirts and all, they rejected this kind of capitalist capture of Christianity to return to a sometimes fanciful different kind of divine imagination, playing with what it was to be among Jesus's first followers. Love feasts. They baptized one another in these toxic rivers in Philadelphia. It was sure, maybe it's the River Jordan. I'm not touching it. But anyway, so I was really excited to spend a lot of time with them because in many ways I did see the Episcopal Church in which I was growing emptying. Because in a way, I spent a lot of time reporting on pretty far-right evangelicals and their critique of this other mainstream Protestantism that I think embodied in many ways in the Episcopal Church, is the liberal elite dying and it's not relevant. And here in the middle, you had these really devoted young people who were really giving their lives to follow Jesus, and it was really exciting. And so writing about them in many ways I hoped would help not draw people to the movement because it's as flawed and human as every other endeavor, but make people aware that this was happening, especially fellow reporters, because in the mainstream press, when you read evangelical or you read Christian, you think one thing. And my job is always to complicate stereotype, to complicate a too simplified picture. And so writing about these guys was an effort to do that.
Thank you. I think you might find it interesting to know that in the American kind of strands of Anabaptist belief, you find the Amish and the Mennonites, as well as the Church of the Brethren. And at first you might be like, well, the Amish are like these people, but then the more you think about it, is there are similarities between some of what's happening here and Amish beliefs.
The central tension being the what is my relationship to the world?
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
What is worldly and what is of God, and that makes it really There are really interesting ethical questions that come up in the course of Circle of Hope, like around the pandemic. You would think, well, okay, these guys are progressive. They must have been absolutely pro, closing their churches. And they were not, because the pastors fought about this. Because Ben, one of the pastors, was like, we don't follow empire. We don't follow what the government tells us. And if you can go to Home Depot, shouldn't you be able to go to church? Right? So there were really live questions about what it meant to live out Jesus's teachings, and that was really fun and interesting to be around.
This is a perfect segue into my next question, and I want to read you a little section from page 41, and this is my Lenten connection. Interestingly, this is the page where you mentioned Shane Claiborne in the book, who's a fascinating guy. I've been on a panel discussion with him once, and he and I got into an argument over exactly what you were just talking about. In this section of the book, Ben, they're having conflict, as they often are, and Ben talks about calling out the world's ills. And Julie turns toward Ben to correct him. Lent wasn't only about addressing wrongs in the external world. It required turning inward, naming your sins, and repenting. Here were the stirrings of what would soon openly divide them. This question of what following Jesus required, focusing outward on healing the world or addressing first sins within yourself. And I'd love for you to talk more about how you saw that play out in this community, this tension between we ought to be worried about the world's sin and this, we ought to be worried about, what sins I detect in you or uncover in me.
This was the central tension this was the central divide in the church. And it was, in some ways, it was generational, where you had, Rod and Gwen White were boomers, and then you had Gen Xers who had been their sort of first followers. And for that cohort, the idea of occupying abandoned buildings in Philadelphia, of living among people, of creating these cells where you met every week with the people who lived around you, of serving the community by showing up and being of service. That was the dominant understanding of what they were there on the planet to do. They called it, in many ways, occupying the places of empire, right? So that is pretty virtuous if you think, okay, they're going to move to the hardest hit places by poverty in Philadelphia. They're going to show up and be part of a community. What it looks like is gentrification, right? Because suddenly the complexion of a neighborhood changes. It's much more problematic than its utopian vision ends up being. But for the younger people in the church, they were not only saying, hey, you guys, that's a lot of white saviorism. We don't want to do that anymore, which the older guard was also like, okay, there are problems with what we've done. The younger guard was saying, we want to look inside. We need to see where's our inner white supremacy? What's the problem between you and me that we're not addressing? And for the older guard, that was a kind of navel gazing that was absolutely an outrage at a time of extreme suffering in the world, right? So you had pandemic shutting everything down. You had the younger members of the church saying, our job is to set up these listening groups and interrogate our own history for our white supremacy. And you had older people being like, are you joking me? Get out there and be of service to somebody else, right? So that tension was really alive, and it was really, really interesting because there was truth to both of those camps. And to watch what was most heartbreaking, which Scott and I have talked about a little bit, and what I hope, although people who are in the book and lived it would disagree, I hope is one of its lessons is like, it's tragic to not be able to hold difference together. That how is it, first of all, it charts a bit of the move in our culture toward that our only value is what we believe. Who are you? Well, what do you believe? Because I'm going to like you or not like you based on what you believe today, right? One of the problems with that at Circle of Hope especially was that if you're not using the right pronouns, you're not up to date with the exact language, then you're out. Part of the problem with that was that many of these guys forgot that 5 minutes ago they were in conservative childhood churches where they were using the wrong language, right? That devotion and faith, if anything, is a process of evolution, and to try to constantly arrest it in time and say who is right and who is wrong was in itself pretty tragic to watch. I did want to say one other thing about the Lent Easter thing, just that the sort of more fun aspects of the book, but Catherine and I, our favorite Easter tradition that Circle of Hope had back in the day when it was a commune was on Easter morning, Gwen, the mom in the church, would smash chocolate Easter bunnies with a meat cleaver because she was smashing the empire, right? And pagan fertility symbols and Hallmark all at once. It was like capitalism goes, pagan rituals go. But it's like, okay, this is a peaceful commune that's smashing chocolate Easter bunnies. So that got to some of the wonderful contradictions. I am thinking we might have to do that this Easter. So, anyway.
It sounds like Veggie Tales to me. I don't know.
There's a Veggie Tales aspect
the bunny,
to it. Yeah.
The bunny, I love the bunny. Okay, so, all right, very serious question, difficult question in the current cultural moment.
Yes.
Where DEI is being eradicated from all facets of government, educational institutions. Is DEI a villain in this story? And as you think about this and how you want to respond, I was thinking about how the rhetorical and ways in which DEI is employed within this community reminded me of something that Maurice Mitchell, who's the head of the Working Families Party, said. And I was wondering, this tangent is going somewhere. Do you know Gia Tolentino?
Yeah, I know who she is, yeah.
So Gia Tolentino wrote this book, Dark Mirror, which is really looks at how all of these left-leaning organizations tore themselves apart, during COVID. So I'm talking about the Sierra Club, the Women's March, which was an organization that had the Women's March happen, and then it shredded itself. It shredded itself over issues of Israel and Palestine. Black Lives Matter itself, also an organization that internally, what you were describing happened. Here are these lofty, idealistic, left-leaning organizations that they didn't even need the right to go after them. They self-consumed. And Maurice Mitchell was the one who said, the left is eating itself. That's his, why does the left eat itself? Why does it, it's sort of, it doesn't need the Wall Street Journal op-ed page to call it into question, because it's going to, it's a circular firing squad.
Totally. Well, to the first question, is DEI the villain? I want to say resoundingly no, because one of my favorite people in the book, who I think is as close, whose behavior is flawed, who has many, who is as human and broken as anyone else, who really has lived in that space. I'm talking about Bethany, who's, a young Black woman who grew up who's very funny, grew up in white spaces, and she's like, with a name like Bethany and how I sound on the phone, people think I'm white till I show up for a job interview. So she used to call herself a term she doesn't like anymore, but she was a missionary to white people because she's like, I can kind of bring them along, so I'm funny and I'm fun, and I can kind of point out racism in a way they might not be able to hear otherwise. Moving toward justice in our world must happen, and that I just trust is the principle is the heart of DEI, that it reflects a necessary and overdue correction. The problem, as it unfolded in Circle of Hope, is that it was wielded as a weapon, not always self-consciously, of power, right? And so people would point out some things, and it's the same purity tests, right? And this idea that you can say, the idea that if people held the wrong beliefs, they were out, I just think that's really, really dangerous, right? So, and that's how the left eats itself, because it sees itself evolving toward a greater social good, and anybody who's not evolving in the same direction or fast enough is out. And there is a self-righteousness that I see reflected in my liberal culture all the time. And there is a hypocrisy that when those who feel left out and disenfranchised and are like, but the left has done the same thing, where was I? Oh, I was on a call today, and people were talking about ambassadorships and the roles ambassadors play, and like, look at these ambassadors, you know, they are big donors. And I'm like, well, during the Obama administration, like, and I named some of the ambassadors and sort of the role that they'd played in Democratic donations bundling. And to say, we just have to be really careful about being accurate, and I'm in a journalist mode, but being accurate about the stories that we tell and making sure that we're not demonizing other people for what we perceive they believe as somehow behind, you know? And that's how the left, that happens within these microcosmic communities. And that, I think, is really deadly. And not only deadly within the community, the reactionary spirit it engenders is even more deadly, right? So, I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it's hugely helpful, and I'm assuming that we didn't hear more from Bethany in the book because she didn't want to talk more. Am I right about that?
No, she would have talked all day. We don't hear more.
But she wasn't a pastor.
She wasn't a pastor, and that became like, who had the right to? So some of how things happen in how this book came into the world, and some of the challenges about it have been people being like, well, why am I not in there? So Circle of Hope doesn't believe that its pastors there's no senior pastor.
Right.
They're non-hierarchical. So the idea that, well, you wrote a book about our church, but you wrote about from the pastor's point of view, like, by definition, you don't understand who we are, right? And my answers to that are varied, which is, you know, the 4 pastors agreed to be part of this, and also they are the employees of the church, right? But one of the things that's hard for Rod and Gwen, the founders of the church, is that they have no named chapters in the book. They wanted to be named. They wanted their own chapters.
Oh, interesting.
So who has the right to speak and how is still complicated.
That's fascinating. I don't think I knew that part.
No, you wouldn't have known that, probably. I mean, that's just...
We're running just a little long, but I want to get a couple of questions from first from our online community. This is Anne from Spokane, Washington, and she asks, after your experience with this church, what elements or characteristics do you see as necessary to form a healthy, lasting church environment? So what makes for good church, according to Eliza?
Humility, humor, you know, and I love the way Circle of Hope found ways to have fun together. I think that was really playing, you know. They had this idea of godly play that, I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to do quite that. I think it's an Episcopal thing too, godly play. But they played together, they had fun, they were, at their best, they were a family, and they were humble about that, and that was pretty beautiful. And devotion, they really showed up to do what they said they would do.
One of our associate pastors, Natalie Owens-Pike, is smiling over here because she was once called to a UCC church to be the minister of fun.
Oh my God, that's great. That's so great.
My friend Glenda asked a question earlier about how removed were you in this process? Did you ever give them advice?
Yes, when I'm talking to non-communities of faith, usually I talk a lot more about what immersion journalism is, like what's the methodology that goes into this work. And in this project, more than any other that I've done in this, which is, we call it fly on the wall. I describe it in the book as like somebody's driving the car of their life. I go up and knock on the window. I'm like, can I get in the back of your car? And they say, yes. I'm going to Boston. I'll be there in 2 hours. And then 5 years later, we're like in Mexico with 3 flat tires. And they're like, what happened in my life? Did you do this? So I'm used to that. It's a messy, morally complicated, really alive process. And what was different here and was that I overstepped. Like I remember in that first scene that I read from, because they were all talking to me about how they really felt and what they really thought the problems were in the church, but when they got together, they wouldn't be as honest with one another. And so when I would know more than they together would know, I would be like, I think you guys should be more honest. And that's not what I'm there to do. So that was a mistake, but it is how I overstepped. And I would say that I became friends with each of them in a different way. And then those relationships, some have endured and some haven't. It's not been easy. And the amount of integrity, this is not the book they signed up to do. And we thought it was gonna be like happy, clappy, like, oh, haha, funny, you have 18 nose pierces and this is Jesus and you're Narcanning people on the streets of Philadelphia, and kind of a great subculture book, which it is much different than that and really a reckoning. And yet when they saw it beginning to turn, they allowed me to continue to follow them. And I think there's great integrity in that. And I'm grateful.
This might be the final question, but I'll reserve the right to ask a follow-up. So you gave us what I think was an honest answer and a journalist answer earlier about why you took this project on, because this is an interesting and important piece of the American religious fabric, and I think we're all in your debt for exposing us to it. It's really important. But why did you take this project on personally? What were you looking for? What was in your heart and your head? I'm wondering if you were searching for something authentic.
Oh yeah, I'm always searching for my childhood home, it didn't really matter my dad did yoga on a sheepskin rug at 5:30 every morning. And that was.
Have we said who her dad is?
Probably not.
Dad was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church.
And what I often forget is that he was I forget it in context of this book, but he was the presiding bishop. He consecrated the first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church, thus leading to a schism. So I watched the culture wars come for Christianity at my kitchen table. And so I am very attuned to what's moving in the culture and how religion, how those two spaces get intertwined. Yes, I've prayed in Sudan with Franklin Graham. There's nothing I haven't done. I'm a practitioner, I'll go do experiential whatever. I was seeking something. I'm always seeking something. That's why I do any project, whether it's about a church or about a family in Western Pennsylvania. But at the end of this book, not too much at the end of it. My relationship to Christianity is complicated. I haven't worked it out yet. I could keep talking. I'm happy to talk about it, but what could I? Once, not many years ago, I found myself in Rishikesh, India. I was wearing robes. I was by the side of the Ganges, and my teacher was doing some puja ceremony. And I was sitting at the edge, my arms were crossed, and I was like, this is lasting forever. I want to go get my cardamom chai. I've had it with this. And I realized you are not 11 years old in church anymore. You paid to be here. And I'm still at the edge of any community of faith being like, this is taking too long. So that kind of sums it up.
All right. I do have a follow-up to that,
okay.
But that was beautiful. Is there hope for the church in North America?
Yes,
Journalist
absolutely.
Eliza, daughter of a bishop.
Yes.
Eliza.
Yes, and these reckonings are key to it. Not reckonings over DEI necessarily, but what is the role of faith? out of times of crisis, amazing things come. Like, this is a time, and I can't really not say, I mean, we are facing the erosion, the annihilation of a political system in America that has been led the country since its inception. That is not, I'm a journalist, I watch who's being sued every day. Every institution, yes, we see the news. The law is being applied against journalism in exactly the way that Orban does it in Hungary. This is not like kind of a metaphor or an overstatement. This is happening, right? The role, I think, of our communities, I don't even know what it is yet outside, but it begins with us showing up and having conversations and things that used to just fill time. I feel this at Princeton with the conversations and panel discussions. They're essential now because we have to hear one another. Who knows what comes next, but being in conversation with one another and talking is essential to whatever is unfolding. And hopefully it's beyond this moment.
Thank you, Eliza. I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. You are welcome to join us here anytime. Worship on Sundays is at 9:30 and 11. To exit this evening, please go through the rear of the sanctuary and out through those clear glass doors. Thank you, bless you, good night.